Welcome to the Unsafe Spaces podcast, where we dig beneath the surface and challenge conventional wisdoms. I'm your host, Michael Bohannes. Victor Hugo said that no army can stop an idea whose time has come. In this show, we explore ideas that can help you change how you see the world, make better decisions in life, and maybe get outside your comfort zone to work on the goals you always wanted to achieve. Hi everyone, this is Michael Bohannes and this is episode 5 of the Unsafe Spaces podcast. I'm very excited about today's guest, David Heinemeier Hansson, the co-founder of Basecamp and co-author of the book ReWork, which sold 600,000 copies since it came out in 2010. But not only that, David has also built the well-known application framework Ruby on Rails, which is something like a programming language. And because this isn't quite enough for him, he also won the Le Mans 24-hour car race in 2014, of all things. And so here's the thing, he accomplished all of that with a 40-hour work week. And that's just spectacular. And I was super excited to have him on the podcast to discuss his work philosophy. And we mainly ended up discussing his latest book, It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work, which he co-wrote with his business partner, Jason. The book is something of a continuation of ReWork, which had pretty crazy instructions such as underdo the competition or planning is guessing and inspiration is perishable, all of which go very much against what we normally hear. And so the latest book sounds a bit similar, but all the while ReWork was mainly targeted at entrepreneurs, the new book, It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work, is directed more at company leaders and managers in general. Because as David says, more and more companies and individuals are glorifying overwork, endless hustle, and no-end grind. I was particularly interested in this because quite recently there was this interesting Medium post from somebody who coined the term, I have to look it up, but somebody coined the term struggle porn, which essentially, where some entrepreneurs are glorifying how hard they're working, and Gary Vaynerchuk is probably one of those biggest proponents of this, like work 18-hour days. And David is, all the while, as he says in the podcast, he's friends with Gary, but he really disagrees with him on this hustle mentality. In the book, he also takes on one of my favorite topics, which is focus. And similarly to another intellectual hero of mine, Cal Newport, he and Jason weigh in on how constant work interruptions destroy the quality of our work, and how the open plan office and chat tools kill the ability to concentrate. But that's just a small part of the book. The main thrust of it is about work-life balance. So what annoys David the most is how the business world persistently ignores scientific findings that 40 hours is the optimal length of a work week, and that you just need rest and sleep and a social life to be happy and productive. And David is a prime example of how this can be achieved. When I was going into the interview, I had a challenge ready for David because I myself work quite a lot and I'm a big fan of people who are completely obsessed with their mission. And so I wanted to ask him if giants like Michael Jordan or Roger Federer could have become legends on a 40-hour week. So that was my challenge for him. But you know what? Over the course of the interview, honestly, I pushed this question away because even if possibly a 40-hour week won't make a Michael Jordan, it sure as hell can make a David Heinemeier Hansson, who has more achievements in his 39 years than almost everyone else has in a lifetime. So without any further delay, please enjoy this interview with David Heinemeier Hansson. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
David, I was thinking a good start for our conversation would be if you could tell me what motivated you to write your latest book with Jason. Is there more crazy happening in the workplace?
Yes, that was essentially the conclusion. Jason and I have been talking about the issues of focus, flow, productivity for quite a few years now. We wrote a book in 2010 called ReWork that covered some of these similar topics. And we kind of just thought that everything keeps getting better. We keep getting faster computers, we keep getting more bandwidth, we keep getting more sophisticated applications to work together. So you'd think we're just on this upward trajectory of progress. Well, when we started talking to people about this topic of it being crazy at work, it seemed like the opposite was happening. That for far too many people, we're going in the opposite direction. The work is getting more crazy, the expectations are getting more unreasonable, and the interruptions are getting more frequent. And we thought that that's just, well, crazy. That when we have all this progress, we should be more calm in the workplace. We should have more time to focus. We should have more space to do that diligent, careful work that we all want to do. Yet we kept hearing as a reply to, so how's work? Oh, it's so crazy. We're so crazy busy.
Yeah.
And I think at the same time, there's been an uptick in sort of this infatuation with crazy work practices, whether that's 80-hour weeks, or in some case, people are bragging about 100-hour weeks or even more, or it's the fawning admiration for the Chinese work practice of 996, which is basically working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, and all this consternation about whether the US or the West is falling behind China because they're working 72-hour weeks or more. And we just thought that all of this this entire atmosphere was not only sort of crazy, as we say, but it was also very counter to how we've been running our business at Basecamp for the past 20 years. And when we've looked at the accomplishments that we've been able to achieve at Basecamp, either when you look at it from a product perspective, or the number of customers that we've signed up, or the impact that we've had through books or sharing open source software, we were like, clearly it is possible to do great work that has meaningful impact on far less than these crazy work schedules. In fact, at Basecamp, we work 40 hours or less a week and have done so since the beginning. So we wanted to basically illuminate the problem, say, this is getting worse, and then at the same time provide a counter narrative, a different role model, and say, let us tell you about how we've done things at Basecamp, and perhaps you can find some inspiration in our work practices, and perhaps you can end up a slightly more calm company if you do.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, the book is really, really good. And one of the things that I always appreciate with your books is that it's very well structured and short of all things. So I read all of your, at least the 3 books, ReWork, Remote, and the latest one. So that is definitely very much appreciated. But can you tell me who is your message actually for? So on the one hand, you seem to be talking to the entrepreneur. On the other, it's also seems like you do want to reach outside of our bubble, the bubble that we are in, and want to reach also like mainstream companies, i.e. large companies. Would you say that you want to be that comprehensive?
Yes, because I think this affliction is that comprehensive, that this isn't something that just afflicts small business owners. It's just as crazy at work at large companies a lot of the times. Maybe some of the most extreme work hour practices aren't as prevalent at large companies, but certainly unrealistic deadlines or overflowing inboxes or endless meetings, perhaps in some ways are even more prevalent at large corporations. So I think it's about raising a general awareness. And it's not just speaking to managers and business owners or entrepreneurs, it's just as well speaking to the workers who are stuck inside companies that work like this, and giving them hope that, first of all, this doesn't have to be normal, that work doesn't have to be crazy, and it isn't crazy everywhere. There are companies who found ways of making work without getting tied up in these crazy approaches. So that should at least give them some hope that even if you have to suck it up right now and have to go through it, perhaps you could try to work to change the practices at your current company. And if that's not working and if they're not receptive, you could start looking for another job.
Yeah. And so I reckon you're not a big fan of Gary Vaynerchuk or Grant Cardone and all their hustle and 10x work mantra, right? As somebody recently pointed it out, pointedly called it struggle porn on Medium. I guess this is not something you appreciate very much.
It's funny because I'm actually quite good friends with Gary V, and I share a lot of the same sentiments that he has about putting in the work for the long term, small town rules. He has a lot of excellent, wonderful ideas for how to do business today. I don't think, unfortunately, he has a excellent idea when it comes to effort in the sense of hustling 18-hour days. I think that's unfortunately a very bad message, to be frank. I think it's worked to some extent for Gary in the way that he works. I don't think it's an applicable or even responsible message to otherwise distribute. So on that point, I very much disagree with Gary, but I agree with him on a bunch of other ideas he has. This was not one of the best ideas he had.
Yeah. But then, and here we're coming to three reservations that I have with your message. Something that, as I was reading, it didn't resonate with me, and I would love to have your take on it. So the first is from my own experience, and it's really hard to start a successful business, and as I'm doing now, so I'm running a content marketing agency, and I do work 80-hour weeks approximately because, and you know why? Because I don't ever want to tell myself that my business failed because I didn't put in enough effort. I think if I restricted myself to 40 hours a week and then failed, there would always be the lingering doubt of, well, if I had worked a little harder, maybe. What would you
Yeah,
say
I
to that?
think that's a common fear that a lot of people have, and I can totally understand that. I will say, first of all, the world is absolutely filled with failed companies that were run by people who worked 80 hours or more per week. So simply working a lot of hours is by no means a guarantee of success. And I think in many cases, it can be part of what makes things not work. When you work 80 hours or more a week, I think you have a lot harder time simply by the fact that there's 24 hours in a day, that if you want a reasonable amount of sleep, that's more difficult. If you want influences and sort of a broader perspective on not just your business, but on life in general, that's also harder to do. It's harder to do things like working out and staying in shape. It's harder to do things like eating healthy. And if your business depends on your creativity, your insights, your what I want to say, your care about the employees that you have and the customers that you serve. Um, those are factors that are hugely influenced by whether you get enough sleep, enough exercise, enough fresh air, enough good clean food. And I think the focus on hours alone is an unfortunate but understandable mistake, because it's very easy to count. So you can say, well, I worked 60 hours or I worked 80 hours. That's an objective measure where you can simply just see, when did you leave the office? When did you shut your computer? It's far more difficult to gauge what was the quality of those hours. So if I worked 80-hour weeks, did I get 80 hours of high quality work? Either because I was, as I said, well rested, well fed, well exercised, or because I spent those hours in a good way. And I think there's way too much focus on the input. How many hours can I spend? And way too little focus on what is the quality of those hours and what is the output of those hours. So I think the much more interesting conversation is, what is the quality of the hours that you spend? In which ways do you spend them? And how do you do so? And I then also say that it is different somewhat for different people in different roles, and what the peak performance that they can get out of sort of the 80th or the 70th or the 60th hour is. If your work consists of rainmaking, calling leads, and hammering out emails, perhaps there is a way for some period of time to sprint through that and simply increase your output. I'm not gonna deny that. I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think it's healthy in the most literal sense of the word.
Yeah.
And I think it sets you up for bad habits where, let's say you are successful. A lot of successful people, if they started out with a habit of 80-hour work weeks, they don't exactly just tone it down to 40 once things start taking off. Because the fact of the matter is, it's only going to get harder in almost all cases. A lot of entrepreneurs have this idea that like starting a new business is hard, and it really is. But running a business is just as hard, and in many cases harder. You'll be responsible for more people. responsible for more customers, responsible for ever bigger expectations. So I don't think that the pressures of running a business just stop because you got something off the ground. In many ways, they compound. And then you're stuck in a loop where you taught yourself or you taught your body and your expectations that 80-hour weeks is this normal thing that I do. And then you end up working 80-hour weeks for the next 10, 20, maybe even 30 years. And then you're going to look back at that and say, but I think even beyond that scope, the fact that there are different roles, as I said, if you're doing sales and it's a matter of sending X amount of emails out and the quality of those perhaps does not matter as much as just the volume, perhaps there's a way. But if you work with people whose product is mainly creative in some form, whether they're writers or they're programmers or they're designers or they're whatever else it is, the quality of their output is far more determined by how they walk into that work rather than how much time they spent there, and the considerations of being well rested, well rounded, well fed start mattering far more. And not only that, I think in a lot of cases, not only do you not get something good out in the 80th hour, you actually get something net negative out. I'm a programmer myself. Jason is a designer, and I know that the times where I have pushed myself to work, let's say, a 60-hour week or pulled an all-nighter, as I did on a few occasions earlier in my career, I would very frequently end up spending the next 3 days cleaning up the mess that one all-nighter had caused, because that was where all of the bugs slipped into the software. And you could sort of sprint to just push something out, but that something you pushed out was of low quality and not a sustainable thing to do. Okay. But as I said, I can completely understand the fear that you don't want to look back and think like, oh, I could have done more. I would just encourage someone to consider the larger picture. Hey, what if it worked, right? What if I wasn't looking back with regret on not succeeding, but I was looking back with regret on how I succeeded or what happened after I succeeded?
Yeah, it's fair enough. But I do feel there is a certain degree of horses for courses, in which, I mean, for a developer, for a designer, definitely. This is like creative work, building something where, every detail matters, so to speak, especially. And I'm glad I have your blessing to put in longer hours when it comes to sales and marketing, probably because there the creativity might not matter as much, but you make a very good point there.
I'll make one last point on that topic, which is the fact that workaholism trickles down. So if you have employees at your business who are in these creative fields as we're talking about, what they're going to take their cues from how we work at this company, they're going to take it from leadership. They're going to take it from the executives. And it's very difficult to espouse a vision of, everyone who works, let's say, with programming or writing or design or whatever else have you, you should just only work 40 hours. But look at me, I'm working 80 hours, or I'm sending emails out at 9:30 p.m., or I'm doing all these other things. Most people will look much closer at your actions than at your words. So if your actions are telling the story that we need to work, say, 80-hour weeks here, then they're going to take that clue and they're going to try to keep up. And it may look as though they're keeping up voluntarily or just because they're passionate or just because they want things to succeed. But really, in most cases, they're keeping up because that's how power dynamics work. That you want to look good to your boss. You don't want to look like the slacker. You don't want to look like the angry or that can't keep up. So you put in what you think needs to be put in. And you sort of just end up with that, whether that's a good thing to do, whether you produce better work with it, or whether you liked your job working like that. That's just the facts of being an employee. So you have to be quite careful, I think, as an executive, as a manager of a company. What kind of message are you sending to the rest of the team when you put in those long hours?
But how is it on the other way around? What if you, for example, got a young single person to work at Basecamp who doesn't have family and who actually wants to put in 80-hour weeks, let's say 60 or 80-hour weeks? Would you tell them, if they're employed at Basecamp, to stop doing that?
That's exactly what I would tell them. I would tell them that this is not a sustainable long-term strategy, and investing your, let's say, 20s or 30s exclusively into a job and not developing other interests, hobbies, friends, cultivating ties with family or community or any of these other things that happen outside of work, is a very poor trade. And it may look like a good idea in the short term, but it's going to come back to bite you if you keep it up for too long. Now, that's not to say that there can't be these short sprints, but I find that these short sprints have a tendency to turning into a marathon very quickly. And then you end up with all these consequences down the line where you can look back at things like, oh, maybe I got promoted or whatever else. And as a 36-year-old, I kind of felt like I made some progress, but you're not going to get those 20s back. And when you sit on that porch as a 60-year-old, a 7-year-old person and look back at your life and went like, oh man, I really spent my 20s well being cooped up in the office all day long and doing nothing else while I had my youth, I don't think you're going to look back fondly on that trade.
Did you yourself, I mean, you are a very accomplished guy. For example, did you create Ruby on Rails on a 40-hour work week?
In fact, we created Basecamp and Ruby on Rails on far less than a 40-hour work week. While we were creating Basecamp, which is back in 2003, I was still in school. I went to Copenhagen Business School, and I knew exactly how much time I spent creating our business because I was working as a contractor at the time, and I would send invoices. And the invoice I would send would be for 10 hours per week, billing Basecamp for the work that I did. And then there was a handful of hours on top of that to work on Rails. But I had a very normal college experience in that regard, that I also had friends and we also did other things. And I had all sorts of other interests that I pursued. And I went to school and did a reasonable job at that. So no, we were not forged, neither Basecamp nor Ruby on Rails, in an investment of 80-hour weeks. In fact, we were forged in the opposite. And perhaps that's why we are so extra passionate about this message, because we've seen just how much you can get done with a fairly modest amount of hours if you make those hours count. And I think that was one of the things working 10 hours a week on Basecamp in the early days really taught me. 10 hours is actually a fair amount of time if you spend it well, and if you spend it with intention and focus, and you don't carve that time up into meetings or interruptions or whatever else have you, because it was very clear in those days that if I wasted just 3, 4, 5 hours out of those 10 hours, we just did not move forward that week. And that feedback loop, having it so tight, really taught me the lesson of the quality of an hour and how they're not all born different or born the same. And I think where we really learned this doubly so was when I finally then joined Basecamp to work full time. I even moved to Chicago and started coming to the office, and I would work 40-hour weeks. Did I get 4 times as much done as when I was working 10-hour weeks? Absolutely not. Not even close. If I even got twice the amount of work done, that's probably pushing it. So that's kind of like just that you're marked by your founding experiences. And that was one of those founding experiences that really marked Jason and I and taught us about the fact that 40 hours felt like a royal feast. When you're used to having 10 hours a week to work on something and you're all of a sudden granted 40, it seems like, geez, this is all the time in the world. And in fact, in many ways it is.
And so your book gives the reader a recipe on how they can do it as well, by simply doing things like, for example, I really like this legacy product that you have, where you're saying you simply don't take that away from customers, and you, for example, only focus singularly on one product. For example, you don't build others, although you could, and all of that. So you are deliberately staying relatively small, right? In order to maintain that lifestyle.
Absolutely. In fact, as we write about in the book, earlier this year, we instituted a hiring freeze at Basecamp. This was following 2017, which was the best year ever for Basecamp, the product, most revenue ever. So we're at the peak of kind of what we've been able to achieve with Basecamp. And still we said, we don't want to hire any more people because we really like this mode of working. Now, I don't think that these two things are that closely linked, that you can only work like we propose if you are a small company. I'd say it's easier, but it's by no means only something that's accessible to a company of 55 people as we have at Basecamp. What we had, our additional considerations was that both Jason and I really enjoy doing the work. We do not enjoy being full-time managers. So I still want to spend a large portion of my time programming. Jason still wants to spend a large portion of his time designing, and together we're working on product ideas, and we want to continue to do that. And what we saw was, if we turned Basecamp into a company of 300 or 1,000 people, we would not get to spend the majority of our time building the product. We would have to spend the majority of our time tending to the managerial needs of the organization. And that just wasn't where we wanted to go. And we then had this, in some ways, perhaps rare setup where we had the freedom to make that choice. That we did not have investors screaming and banging on the doors, asking us to become a unicorn or 10x their investment, where that's a lot of times where a lot of the pressures come from. It's not necessarily that it's just the entrepreneur or company owner who wants to chase never-ending growth. A lot of it comes from the funding models that are, especially in technology, where you have a very specific timeline and trajectory. Angel investments and venture capital want you and need you to follow for their model to work. And because we did not jump on that train, because we didn't take angel or venture capital investments, we were granted this special opportunity of basically making different choices. So the choice that we made, and that's not necessarily a choice I would say like that's a prerequisite to having a comp company or whatever. It was more a choice of if Jason and I want to work at Basecamp for the next 20, 30 years, what do we have to do so that we enjoy that? And the conclusion was we have to keep working on the product. And yet at the same time, we also didn't just want to hand over the reins of running the managerial aspect of the company to some quote unquote professional manager. So we thought like, hey, we can have our cake and eat it too. Just keep the company relatively small, and we can stay in control of the company itself and spend the majority of our time doing our favorite things.
Mm-hmm. So how has your message been received so far? I saw that you're quite vocal on Twitter. You got yourself blocked by Mark Suster recently. Have companies been hating on you, or have any of the hustlers and so on saying, well, those are like underachievers, or have you received any kind of blowback like that?
A little bit, but not direct head-on attacks mostly. Most of the blowback, if you'd call it, or opposition that I've seen has been in ways as the Mark Suster episode where he goes out and applauds the Chinese 996 approach to work and fawning over how it's both working smarter and harder, and that's how you beat the competition, which I find utter nonsense. But the main reception to the book has actually been extremely good. Most people, or I should say, a lot of people who've read the book walk away with perhaps some new ideas, but just as much a reaffirmation of the things they kind of already knew, but were too afraid to say. That they were too afraid to not be part of the bragging about how busy they were or how overworked they were, because that is the predominant culture right now, particularly in the US. And I think, unfortunately, it's also infecting other parts of the world. When I talk to European entrepreneurs, a lot of them seem to be just basking in the inferiority complex of how things are done in, say, Silicon Valley. And some of the aspirational work practices that some European entrepreneurs are taking from that is, oh, we should work like they do there. We should look up to the people like Marissa Mayer, who advocates 120-hour weeks being possible if you're just strategic with your bathroom breaks, or they're listening to people like, that's a legit quote, by the way. You can look that story up. It's hilarious and
wow, that's funny. I haven't heard.
Or even just the examples of people like Mark Suster or other venture capitalists who are so keen on applauding extremely abusive work practices like 996 that are managerially mandated work practices that are it's kind of hilarious that that's coming out of China, of all places, not the least because it's actually an illegal work practice that they're pursuing. In any case, no, I think the time is right. And I think one of the reasons the time is right for this message is that the infatuation and applauding of everything that big tech has been doing, we're waking up to the consequences of that. I think it used to be far more true a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, that the press and others in the press were very uncritical about how the sausage was getting made. And they were falling over themselves for applauding either the growth of Uber or the rise of Google or any of these other large tech companies. And now, just in the last couple of years, there's finally been a growing skepticism about what the consequences of these companies have been. And thus, because there is more skepticism about how these companies operate, there's also finally some skepticism about their work practices. And people aren't as uncritically looking at how does Google work, how does Amazon work as a model that they should follow in their own business, which used to be far more true, I'd say, 5 years ago.
Mm. So finally, what would you advise to, I think your advice is very well received and very clear for company leaders. What would you advise an employee who wants to work like you suggest, but are trapped under a crazy maniacal boss who works them into the ground? Is there any hope for them?
I think there are certain ways where you can be the change you want to see. So you can stop interrupting people in all sorts of ways. You can try to protect your own time by blocking off the calendar, making sure that you're segregating all those meetings your boss is lobbing at you into a time frame where it doesn't blow up every single day. So there are defensive postures that you can take as an individual employee. At some point, you are up against forces bigger and larger than you. And our message in part there is that, hey, here's some defense tactics that you can use in the short term, but in the long term, you owe it to yourself. If you want to do the best work of your career, if you want to have a life in the fullest sense of the word outside, well, not even just outside of work, encompassing work, then you need to find a place that's receptive to these ideas. And I think, thankfully, there is a growing sort of adherence to this. This is not just Basecamp that works like this. There are plenty of other companies who've learned and starting to understand the value of not pushing people to the max all the time and not burning them out, that it's simply bad business to operate like that. What's kind of ironic to me is that this is not a new revelation. In 1914, Henry Ford had a study done on his assembly line workers on what was the most productive amount of time that they should go to work. And he famously reduced long work weeks to 40 hours because that was simply the optimal time for the mass production assembly line that he had to avoid defects, to avoid having to redo work. That 40 hours a week was a good amount of time. And then we kind of just took for granted to some extent this victory of both productivity and worker protection over many decades. And then somewhat, I don't know, starting maybe late 80s, mid 90s, there was this growing sense that executives were lauded and applauded if they were the hardest workers, which really was an interesting shift. If you look back at sort of early 80s, 70s observations on executive culture, it was far more one of, well, the executive at least is not going to work as hard as the blue collar worker. And in fact, that was part of a bit of a historic class tension that you would go, all of these workers who worked on the machine floor would go, well, the executive is just off playing golf, or they're just sitting at their desk reading a newspaper, or they're just slacking off. That was a moment of reflection and of leisure was seen as the prize in some ways for the executives who made it to the top of the company. Then that narrative completely shifted. And now the prize for being a CEO of, say, Yahoo is that you have to work 120 hours a week. Wait, what? Like, how did we swap the roles between who supposedly had success in the workplace from someone who could, quote unquote, get away with maybe only working 30 or 40 hours a week, to now someone who has to embrace and champion and be thankful for the fact that they are essentially chained to the office desk 120 hours a week. That's just madness.
Yeah, well, there's a game theoretical problem there as well, because probably all things being equal, if somebody works 40 hours and somebody else works 50, the person doing 50 will, all things being equal, probably accomplish a little bit more. So there is the incentive to
Well, let me push back on that right there. It's first of all, it's right in your statement, all things being equal. All things are never equal when you look at workplace studies like this. And in fact, there has been a vast number of academic imperial studies done on the effects of productivity and creativity at certain amounts of work. And universally, these studies have come back to say it doesn't work to work like that you're not getting more value produced. You're putting more in, but you're not getting more out. And I think that that's one of the things that really offends me about the current discussion and climate and culture around work practices is it's just anti-science. Not only just in terms of how many hours you spend in the office, but on as basic things as just sleep. The number of executives who proudly proclaim that they can get by with, let's say, 6 hours of sleep every night, those stories are not even stories anymore because it's such a common trope. Now, if you look at the science of sleep science, there's a great book out recently called Why We Sleep that goes over a lot of the academic and imperial studies on this topic. Basically says that the vast majority of adults need 8 to 8.5 hours of sleep. And if you get as little as 1 hour less every night, you will build a sleep deficit that has a very material impact on your creativity and your productivity. And it seems like if we can't even just get to terms in such a basic concept of human physiology as how much sleep we need, and we can't listen to the scientists and the researchers who are coming up with the facts around this, we're really quite far off. And I just encourage anyone who sort of thinks that you can continue to burn the midnight oil in this way and come out ahead to just read up a little bit on science. I think you'll very quickly get dissuaded from thinking that the 80-hour work week, or it's the case of Marissa Mayer, the 120-hour work week is actually a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. And there is a lot of inspiration to be gotten from your book. And I really very much recommend to anyone to read it. It's one of the best books, definitely, I've read this year. Can I ask one last question? I wonder, I have just an interest as a content marketer. I'm very interested in how the books have helped Basecamp as a business. Do you see a spike of new business when a book comes out, or are these two things, Basecamp and the books, completely unrelated?
They're very much related. And I think our number one strategy for marketing and sales to some extent has been to build an audience. And that audience is built slowly over time in very diffuse ways that are hard to track. But the compounding results of exercise are very clear. We spend, as of right now, $0 every month on marketing. We spent $0 on AdWords, $0 on Facebook marketing, $0 on sponsorships or banners or whatever. We've experimented with a bunch of different things in the past, but we found that simply doubling down and investing in our audience has been the way to go. And ReWork, for example, our most successful book, sold 500,000 copies around the world. We keep getting emails still from new readers of the book who go, this taught me a lot, and I am now clearly more favorable to the authors and the business that they represent. So if I know someone in my circle of friends who needs something like Basecamp, I'll be sure to recommend it. And that's exactly what we're seeing, that Basecamp has been powered by word of mouth and recommendations, not just from the customers that we have who've signed up for the product, but just as much from the audience that we built over now 20 years. And the books are an absolutely integral part of that process.
Absolutely. And they are I love to see the fact that quality wins. It's one of those cases of, normally you always think like, yeah, you have to put a lot of promotion into it and so on, but your books are really a very good example of the case of the Mona Lisa doesn't tweet.
Unfortunately, I tweet, and I tweet far too much. But yes, I appreciate the sentiment, and I think that's not to say that that's always going to be how it plays out. I think one of the traps that lay for anyone analyzing any business or any person is the halo effect. and that just because whatever and whatever they made succeeded, that how they made it was why they succeeded. And I think that is actually the main trap people fall into with workaholism. You look at someone like Elon Musk, and he can't stop bragging about how many hours he spent sleeping on the concrete floor of his factory, and then people go, oh, that's why Tesla's successful, because Elon Musk will sleep on the concrete floor. And you go, do you know what? No,
Yeah.
that is not a proper distinction between
Exactly.
correlation and causation.
Yeah.
Elon is succeeding in spite of his very poor work approaches, and in fact are causing his company tremendous pain and suffering, both economically and in many other ways, because he's working like this, because he's tweeting out crazy shit at 3 a.m. in the morning. That is sort of an idea of something we should model and something we should replicate. There are many other ideas and ways of approaching things from the fundamentals where you can learn a lot from Elon Musk, but don't try to learn from his work principles.
Yeah, no, and if our culture is like it's very much influenced by Elon Musk, I think you and Jason are great representatives of the counterculture. And I hope that your audience will keep growing, because your message is really important to be spread. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening, guys and gals. If you like this and want to know when new episodes come out, subscribe to the Unsafe Spaces podcast on unsafespacespodcast.com. And I see you around when the time comes to again dig beneath the surface and challenge conventional wisdoms.